Herzlich willkommen hier in der Spurinitiative. Mein Name ist Marek Burmeister von der Aktionsgemeinschaft Solidarische Welt. Die Aktionsgemeinschaft Solidarische Welt gibt es schon seit über 60 Jahren. Wir sind eine entwicklungspolitische Nichtregierungsorganisation und unterstützen Partnerorganisationen in Indien, Brasilien, Westafrika und Simbabwe. Zum Thema heute grün getarnt, Klimaschutz auf dem Rücken des globalen Südens. Das ist auch ein Thema, was viele unserer Partnerinnen und Partner konkret beschäftigt.
I'm going to switch to English now, and together, we will explore some interesting questions around perspectives on climate justice. And I have amazing speakers here today. I'm really honored to share the stage with you all. One person is joining us over Zoom. I'm going to just introduce briefly our speakers of today. First, our first speaker is Adenike Oladozu, joining us via Zoom today. Hello, Adenike. Adenike is a climate activist and founder of the I Lead Climate Movement. Currently based in Gießen, Germany, she advocates for climate action across Africa, focusing on climate education, sustainable development, and amplifying the voices of vulnerable communities. My second speaker, Tony Naushin, is an economist by training, an NGO worker by profession, and a degrowth and climate justice activist by passion, with organizing experience at the grassroots level for more than 12 years. And my final speaker, Diana Figueroa, is a master's student of political science at the Free University of Berlin. She is currently working for the International Tropical Forest Policy Team at the German Agency for Development and Cooperation, short GIZ. Question goes to Adenike.
Ali, I just came back from COP29 in Baku, and just kind of stressful because of different activities that we have each day. But then I've initiated the Fridays for Future movement. I started the movement first in Africa, and I see that there's a need or the demand, and I also see that young people have to participate in decision making that matters to our future. And so I saw that movement as a way of getting more people involved in climate action and educating our population that have low or no idea about what climate change means. And so what we basically do is to go to schools in terms of climate education in school, educate young people, and in the grassroots to also mobilize people to also understand why the climate crisis means. So one of those things that we do when we go to the grassroots is the fact that people sometimes burn down the crop residues. That means after each cropping season, people set their farmland ablaze because they want to clear their farmland for the next cropping season. But that activities alone doesn't only contribute to emissions, which is going to lead to or affect or lead to the changing of our environment, but it also affects the productivity of the farmland in terms that those microbes that are needed to help to increase the fertility of the soil, it affects the soil in return once it is burnt or once it is set ablaze. And so those activities are something that these communities are always engaged with, and I think is sustainable, but it affects them on the long run. And at the same time, you go to communities, they cut down their trees for firewood, and I think it's just normal. And so when we go for community outreach or actions, those are the things we raise awareness on, so that those unconscious activities that they do, they could also be able to correct it and know the reason why trees are important in the communities, not for firewood or other kind of activities. And at the same time, being a climate justice leader, sometimes it demands a lot, because for me, I make videos on YouTube, across my social media handles, and as well, I write a lot of articles. So if you go to my website, at www.womenandcrisis.com, you see over 100 articles. So I write articles to also influence decision makings, and you could also find my work on international newspaper as well. And so just recently as well, we have the German media that came to Nigeria called ZDF. I don't know, maybe many of you have heard about it. It's a popular media in Germany. So they came to Nigeria to film my activities. And so you can check it on their media or on their website until you will see a 28 minutes video of the activities that came to Nigeria to film my work. So just to tell you about the progress that we are making when it comes to climate justice, trying to make the awareness across the world, because this is something that we need solidarity. Though we know that in Africa we bear the brunt, and that is why we need solidarity across all the countries around the world so that we come together to fight for climate justice. And so more specifically in Nigeria, just to mention here that we are not just faced with a single crisis when it comes to climate change, but we are faced with multiple of those crises happening at the same time and at different frequencies. And so we are faced with drought, flood, heat wave, and we are seeing the impact in terms of food insecurity, because definitely when there is flood, this flood happens in where there are agricultural landscape. And so it washes away the farmers' land and also make the communities become vulnerable. And so the population at large becomes vulnerable to the climate effect. And so also just to mention here that when we talk about climate change, people always talk about our population to be the root cause of the climate crisis. But then I always used to mention the fact that Africa has large population, but yet we just contribute just less than 3% to the global emissions. So that tells us that our population is not the problem. It's the unsustainable rise in emissions from those small countries with the smallest population that is making communities like mine, or putting our entire population at risk of the climate crisis. So we are now faced with more frequencies of climate change affecting almost all the states in Nigeria and other island and vulnerable countries. So this is why we always look at it at the fact that we need to do something. We don't have to wait until when we, or maybe other countries that are not impacted now, to be most impacted before we act. We need to act, because if we don't act, the more we are going to see more climate migrants crossing dangerous borders.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for that elaborate explanation about your work and your perspective that the climate crisis goes way beyond funds, goes way beyond carbon emissions. Although these things are relevant, the climate crisis is a social crisis. And this is something that we, in Europe, I feel, haven't really grasped to the full extent. And with that, my next question goes to you, Tony.
As we are trying to tackle with this discussion, I guess it's also clear to many of us how it's not very simple. It is many, like, multifaceted topic that we're talking about. And one of the struggles, I think, just quickly to start to address the question, like when we are talking about climate justice, and this was implicitly already discussed, but I just want to make it explicit to build from there. So when we say climate justice, we mean that, so there is an issue of injustice at it, right? And from your input, from what others said, that the impact, the reason or the main underlying cause of climate change and the people who are being impacted by it is not the same group of people, or not concentrated in the same regions of the world. So that's what then we started calling climate injustice, that climate crisis is mainly caused by the high carbon emissions. And if we look at the sources of those carbon emissions, it's heavily associated with certain forms of production, transport system, and even certain lifestyles. Like we know from the recent report that Oxfam published that top 1% of world's wealthiest is responsible for the amount that the bottom 60% produces. So that means just a very small number of people, like just the billionaires alone, is responsible for driving the climate crisis. And that number, I think, when we look at that, what does that mean from top 1% versus the bottom 60%? It's something in the area of like 60 million people is driving equivalent of 3 billion or a bit more, 4 billion people, what 4 billion people is responsible for. But that's like a very, so there's a huge imbalance in it. And what Anu was saying before that, but even then in the whole climate discourse, the main discussions we hear, oftentimes we hear that as if population is a crisis, and that's not only in global north. I have heard also in global south, many people, and oftentimes from a certain class, the rich like would be talking like, of course, if there's so many people, no wonder climate is destroying. But it's also, this is how it shows how the narrative is completely ruled by certain, like again, who has power is ruling the narrative. And recently, like this year in October, there was one article that looked at if we tried to take care of the basic needs for 10 billion people within the existing planetary boundary, is it possible or not? And it shows that, yes, it is possible. If we move away from, so it focuses on these two premises, that we can provide for 10.4 billion people within the planetary boundary, their basic needs, if we opt for a non-meat-based, like so vegan diet, and if you're moving away from heavy, like carbon-intensive consumption. So these are the only two things. So that means that even today, even it's possible to provide for such a big population, but we wouldn't hear those things in the mainstream discussions. And one of the reasons is because what you were all saying, that climate crisis is a social crisis, there's a political crisis, and that means a lot of the discussion, the solutions needs to happen politically and socially. And because there are vested interests, you named fossil fuel, like I think you both named fossil fuel. So that means because there are these vested interests, we don't get to hear what are the real solutions. And then I'm coming to the point of answering what you were asking me, that then when we're even talking about solutions, even different movements, when we are trying to demand for climate justice or talking about climate solutions, we are often falling consciously or unconsciously to the trap of the status quo, like what the main narratives produce, how we think, and then trying to address climate crisis just as a technical crisis, not looking at the power dynamics that's at the core. And that means, for example, when we're talking about how do we see this colonial dynamics being produced even for green projects that are supposed to help us. Like there are many cases like that has been heavily discussed. The German government did this partnership with Moroccan government, right, around for this renewable energy and the green hydrogen. And there are many, it's well documented, and people are already criticizing that this has heavy justice issue. The Moroccan government, most of the solar power projects that are being built in Morocco, over 3,000 hectares, over 1,500 hectares, that are stopping the local community, the local agro-pastoralists, to have access to those land. The green hydrogen, like then now we see the giants like Total and Shell very eagerly, who are the fossil fuel giants, want to opt for green hydrogen. And here maybe I call me cynical, I'm like, why is Total so interested to go for this hydrogen? Because then we see they want to use the same existing LNG gas infrastructure, it's possible, and that's what is needed. And then while they call it green, it's not. So there is again like a huge green masking, or the greenwashing that's happening. So all of those process, what's happening, that even when we are seeing certain form of energy transition, just by simply moving from fossil fuels to renewables, first of all, there are lots of challenges, and also from my work, when we're trying to move the finance, we see the investors still the fossil fuels give like 100, 200% higher returns. Green projects are not, so at the beginning they need high investment and they give return over a long term, longer period. So it's not as attractive for investors to move to green projects. So there is also, again, this profit motive that's stopping us to really have this transition fast. But even beyond what we're seeing, that there are certain thinking. So if we are not moving away from what you were starting, or like what the others already shared, this extractive thinking, we are necessarily then just reproducing, and that's what we're also seeing with the cobalt mining, with all of the minerals that are needed for renewables. Those crises around those mining regions are intensifying. And if you're not honest, like, it's possible to not look at it. It's very possible, just because we need a green transition, let's feel better. And there are changes happening. So I think I also don't want to say that all the green projects are bad or there is no real progress. There are certain cases where we see also, like especially in Asia, now we see that the green, like renewables are being deployed at a much faster rate. So those things are happening, but at the same time, unless we are honest and we can really look into the issues of how and why we are reproducing the same problematic dynamics, even when we're talking about energy transition, we won't be able to address. And I think the one big thing is, and of course, because I'm an advocate for degrowth, we have to talk, we cannot continue. And as I was saying, the study that shows that we can take care of everyone, but we need to heavily adjust of how we live. We need to talk about the billionaires that are burning down the planet. So those are the important issues that we have to get at. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Yeah, I think it's a very vital. The last point really stuck with me. It's a very vital point to always consider that every solution that we try to apply within capitalist contexts will eventually reproduce the same racist and colonial structures. And with that, I would like to go to Diana, and and I have a question about your project, Acción Guajira. It focuses on the impact of large-scale projects in indigenous lands in Colombia, and you have already introduced a little bit about your project, and maybe you could explain how energy projects have led to land conflicts in your region and in the involvement of the project.
Basically, the thesis which we are working in the group I am, so Acción Guajira, which, as I say, is very varied and multiple, because it's not only students which are there, but also activists that are living in the region. And this is very important to mention, because as my co-panelists also said, building consensus not only in high-level spaces like the COP29, but also in the territory. It's a complex process. And we have been accompanying as observers how their self-organized roundtables and discussions about how the energy diversification, the economic diversification of the region, which path should that follow. We have been following that process very closely. So there are multiple persons on that roundtable. We're talking about Afro descendants, peoples that are also living in La Guajira, and that have been experience displacement when the coal arrived to the region, and now they haven't, and even if the national constitutional court have sentence that they should be resettled, like, this is something that hasn't happened yet in the region. So we're talking about like a minority in the department, which is struggling not only now that the transition is happening, but when the coal already arrived to the region. Then we also have indigenous peoples that are seated in those tables. Concretely, we're talking about the Wayuu population. And this is also a very complex topic, because for someone that is not an anthropologist or that doesn't have the time to study how the internal governance structures of the Wayuu could maybe not understand that, for instance, they have two types of groups inside the indigenous community, which means that they are not homogeneous. So, for instance, we're talking about the traditionals, and we are talking about the indigenous representatives. But the indigenous representatives are the ones that are in contact with the internal minister in a ministerium.
The domestic minister.
The domestic minister, thank you. While the other ones are, or do not want to get in touch with the domestic minister. So both of them have different opinions regarding energy projects, for instance. And then we also have like the rural communities that are not living, for instance, in Riohacha, which is the capital of La Guajira, which receive maybe once a week water, sweet water, and that have different priorities from the ones that are living in Riohacha, which has a water supply at least every day, even if only for a few hours. So we are talking, and then we also have the workers of the mining of El Cerrejón and the other mines that are in the region, which have maybe confronted interest because they have been working from a company that have allowed them to pay for their children's studies, but at the same time they know that their work at the mine is destroying their environment, and they have seen that because La Guajira was before the coal and the mining coal arrived to the region, was an agricultural department, and the agriculture was the main activity. So as you can see, there is a broad spectrum of perspectives, and it's not easy to sit down, not in Baku, not in Riohacha, and get to a consensus. It's very hard. And we have seen that just right now, you were talking about climate finance, the less developing countries and the Iceland states were pledging for 1.3 trillion to finance the climate finance that are trying to repair the damage that the climate crisis is it's already causing. And this is also the necessary climate finance that is needed for countries like Colombia and regions like La Guajira for make the necessary transition. And how this transition is happening in the region, that's another topic, which is very problematic as well. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much about your perspective and also your working experience. The challenges are huge, and I think I really liked what you said about the levels of challenges, that we have these really big degrees of external financial and decision-making bodies like the UNFCCC, and that, I don't know if everybody has heard about this, but the negotiations around the climate finance have been prolonged currently at the current COP, because the European Union was okay with an annual sum of 250 billion, thank you, 250 billion of financial support for climate finance, and what was demanded from Global South countries was a 1.3 trillion of an annual pledge, and I think it's important to just hold space for the immense amount of money that is asked for. But if we think about it, it's actually not that much of an immense amount of money. It is something that comes from this demand is also rooted in the jeopardy of the daily livelihoods of people who are most affected by the climate crisis. And then also this is rooted in historic continuities of how colonial powers, which are currently globalized and industrialized nations, have benefited from this situation. And so there is a clear demand towards these countries because there hasn't been much happening to actually provide even the circumstances. And yeah, I think because we don't have that much more time anymore before we go into the Q&A with the audience, I think I have two questions for my panelists before we go into the final section. Maybe I would like to hear from whoever feels like they want to answer this. What do you think international support, especially in this dynamic of global South, global North hierarchy, what can this international support rather look like?
I think for a long time, many movements from the global South actually even asked, it's not about support. Many times it's like, stop continuing the harm. So in many ways, because what's oftentimes also wants even the development initiatives, and there's been lots of criticism, there are a lot of documented cases as well, like what goes as aid there, it's also masking a lot of way to continue exploitation, maintain control over different regions. So then in this what were they called, this international monetary flow. So they did I'm trying to remember the report where they showed that the countries in Africa who receives aid, so the inflow of aid for each $1 going to the countries in Africa, $25 outflows. So it's actually, and there was even a connection between the countries that were the biggest givers were also the highest receivers of this outflow. So what they were trying to show that, and oftentimes it's not often very clear, but aid itself is a way to continue a lot of power in different regions. So that's one. And then what we were talking before, that oftentimes these projects, and what we even didn't have time to go into, even the forest reservation projects itself is also very colonial, where they're stopping people who have been, like, over hundreds of years, the core guardian of those lands, and then those forests are stopped from going there. And many times there are even international NGOs like WWF has those cases where their forest guards were involved with creating violence. So these are all of those documented cases. What this tells us that even before supporting, there is already ongoing harm. So the first step would be to stop the harm. And then the second thing is to then stop the harm in the name of supporting. So once these two are done, then we can start talking about supporting, I guess. And then the other bit is what you were also saying, like 1.3 trillion that's been asked. But if you look at all that money, like what's happening necessarily now through this capitalist process, we are cashing out the planet, right? Like the planet is collapsing, but we have this huge amount of money sitting in these different banks. We don't even know when we will spend all those money like that we are producing. So we are really churning out our planet and making this huge amount of money that we don't know what we will do. And it's causing so much pain and destruction to communities, to people, to nature. So in a way, I think even a monetary amount of like reparation, it's actually what we do. That's not what we would need. We really need to reverse. We really need to find processes to regenerate. So at core, I think this number just represents that dynamics, that there's all this money that's sitting, But even if we give back money, it's not going to solve the polluted rivers. It's not going to undo the harms, the pains, and the communities that have been destroyed. So it's really, we have to think in terms of processes, in terms of reorganizing, in terms of how we completely move away from the way we are doing things now to imagining a future and also doing things differently. So I would say that's where we have to start, which again, of course, is very difficult. It's not easy, but at the same time, within the current structures, as we know, like year after year, even when they said they would do 100 billion, it was much smaller than 1.3 trillion. And even that 100 billion was never reached when it was the pledge. So again, it becomes like a futile thing where so much energy is wasted and we are not achieving anything solid. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for that perspective. I think that was a very, very valuable point that you made, that we need to firstly address the harm that is happening, that is at the base of how the system is functioning, and that through addressing things from within the system has to come first with addressing the harm, for example, through social hierarchies. And yeah, I think the last question that I want to give out to my panelists, and I would like to hear your opinions on that, is a question that relates a little bit to Germany. Germany aims to be climate neutral by 2045 with the Net Zero project. And how do you assess this goal from a climate justice perspective?
What I would expect is that each leader in Germany, what kind of climate agenda do they have to make climate action a reality? Every leader have to act on it. They don't have to postpone, because by the time we keep postponing climate action, it's like the next generation coming behind to do the work which they have not bear, or they have not added or contribute to the climate crisis.
Yes, thank you so much for that explanation. I think the question around, yeah, why do we postpone climate neutrality? I think that's a very central aspect. I was just repeating basically on what you were saying, that this question of why do we think that climate neutrality is something that we can only achieve in 2045, and I think that there is a central aspect of still holding very, very tightly to this grip of still wanting to maintain the system as it is right now.
Yeah, I can just add that what you said, that definitely there is clinging to the status quo and trying to make every last bit of money that's possible before phasing out. And like we are seeing that, of course, there is a trend that fossil fuel projects are not, like the investors don't see them being reasonable more than next 5 years. So those things are moving, but the other bit is, I think we are not taking, or we haven't found ways to take the tipping points into consideration. We haven't been able to take the irreversible processes, the feedback loop into consideration, and rightly so, that any action that we take now, the earlier actions have a much more higher marginal impact than the same action if we take it in 2035 and 2040. So even in this capitalist economic logic, it makes sense to take climate action now. And even then, when we do it, so actually 45 climate neutrality in many ways, because it takes time to make those changes happen, that actually even would be a good goal. But the way we are stalling, like with this net zero concept, how we are stalling any solid action to the later time, that is a big problem. And yeah, exactly. So that's something we'd have to really try to achieve. And I think this is something is not sinking well enough within not the leaders, not the business community. And the only hope, like maybe this terrible catastrophes like we saw this year in Spain, or in the hurricanes in the US, would wake people up. But then at the same time, we are not seeing that's happening. So this is just, yeah, I guess we probably have to keep saying those things. Yeah, just that.
Yeah, maybe I just want to mention that the structure of how debt is built, it plays an enormous role. And this is why there is a lot of initiative related to debt for climate, because the dependency that the debtors had is also an incentive to continue this macabrous and perversive economy under the terms we have it today. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think just to like summarize on that for a second, I think there can be so many incentives actually to act now, and I think it's a question of how much are we willing to give up, or how much are we willing to actually like leave, especially here in Europe, our places of comfort, our places of privilege, our access to capital as well. And just to repeat the words of my speakers, freely repeat the words of my speakers, it might be too late in 2035, so it is the time to act now, and it is the time to actually center humans at climate action. It is to center humans at climate action, and to center human well-being all over the planet equally much. And with that, I want to thank my speakers. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Adenike. And yeah, thank you all for listening.